The Varrock didn't arrive with diplomacy. They didn't send signals, probes, or introductory transmissions. There was no slow reveal in the outer system, no careful deceleration toward inhabited space. What humanity's deep array detected in the early hours of March 14, 2187, was a distress signature, not a weapon lock, not a fleet maneuver, but something closer to a scream encoded in coherent light. Sergeant Marcus Dane was not the most decorated soldier in the United Earth Defense Corps. He was not the youngest, or the most decorated, or the most likely to appear in a recruitment broadcast. He was, by nearly every administrative metric, unremarkable. 11 years of service, 2 rotations on the Outer Rim stations, 1 commendation for tactical restraint during the Proxima Colony riots that nobody ever talked about, and a psychological profile that used the word methodical where others used words like inspired. What Marcus had, what his commanding officers had noted quietly across multiple performance reviews, was an almost unnatural ability to stay calm when the situation around him became mathematically unsolvable. The situation on March 14th was mathematically unsolvable. He'd been assigned to the UES Archimedes as part of the 4th Diplomatic Security Detachment, a unit that most of his fellow soldiers privately called the babysitters. Their job was to protect the personnel of Earth's First Contact Protocols Division, a group of scientists, linguists, xenobiologists, and political theorists who believed, with almost touching sincerity, that when humanity met another intelligent species, the meeting would happen in a controlled environment. A conference room. A neutral station. An agreed-upon frequency. Not in a debris field 40,000 kilometers from Europa, where something the size of a small aircraft carrier was bleeding atmosphere and shedding hull panels in a slow, catastrophic spiral. "That's a ship," said Dr. Lena Vasquez, pressed against the observation port beside him. Her voice was perfectly level, which Marcus recognized as the particular calmness of a person who has not yet fully processed what they're looking at. "Yes," Marcus said. "It's not ours." "No. Marcus." She turned to look at him. "That is an alien spacecraft." "I can see that." He was already running numbers in his head. The vessel's trajectory was decaying. It wasn't going to stabilize on its own. Whatever had hit it, and something had hit it, the scoring along the port side was unmistakably weapons damage, had taken out at least the primary drive and what he guessed were attitude control systems. The ship was rotating slowly along its long axis, which meant the crew inside, if there was a crew, was experiencing a gravity environment that was becoming increasingly unlivable. He keyed his communicator. "Lieutenant Brev, this is Dane. I need you on the bridge now. Bring the captain." "Dane, what?" "Alien vessel, active distress, Europa orbit. Move." There was a pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long, and then the sound of boots on deck plating. The next 6 hours were the most documented, most debated, and most argued over 6 hours in human history. The decision to approach the Varrock vessel was not made by Marcus Dane. It was made by Captain Irina Solberg, after consultation with the First Contact Division, with Earth Command's Emergency Protocol Office, and with 3 different legal advisors who all cited different sections of the Outer Space Treaty Amendments of 2156. What Marcus did was drive the shuttle. He piloted the Archimedes approach vehicle, a reinforced diplomatic tender never designed for anything resembling combat, to within 200 meters of the dying alien ship, matching its rotation with a series of thruster adjustments that his NAV computer kept flagging as inadvisable. The airlock, when they found it, was recognizable as an airlock. That was the first thing that surprised everyone. Not a mystery, not an abstraction. A door. A slightly larger door than human engineering would have produced, with a different sealing mechanism and atmosphere indicators that showed a mix of gases that was not breathable by humans but was not immediately lethal either. They went in wearing suits. What they found was not what the science fiction of 2 centuries had prepared them for. There was no vast cathedral interior, no bioluminescent everything, no organic curves and alien grandeur. The Varrock ship, they didn't know the name yet, that would take another 3 weeks of linguistic work, was a military vessel, and it looked like one. Tight corridors. Utilitarian construction. The smell of ozone and something copper adjacent drifting through the suit sensors. And bodies. 12 of them, in suits of their own, which told Marcus immediately that whatever had happened to this ship had happened fast. You don't put your crew in suits unless you think you might lose atmosphere. 11 of those bodies were not moving. The 12th was. She was taller than any of them by about 30 centimeters, and her suit was different from the others, heavier, with additional articulation at the joints, and a series of markings along the shoulder pauldrons that Marcus, who had spent enough time around military personnel to recognize rank insignia in any context, immediately understood were not decorative. She was someone important. She was also, by the readout on her suit's external status panel, a panel Marcus couldn't read but Dr. Vasquez photographed and later spent 40 hours decoding, running out of atmosphere at a rate that suggested she had less than 90 minutes of breathable air remaining. Marcus looked at Dr. Vasquez. Dr. Vasquez looked at Marcus. "We can't just leave her," Vasquez said. "I know. Earth Command hasn't authorized." "I know." He crossed the corridor in 4 steps, crouched beside the Varec officer, and began examining her suit's external connections with the focused attention of a man who has decided, quietly and without drama, that the question of authorization is no longer the most relevant question in the room. The most relevant question was whether the emergency atmosphere coupling on his own suit was compatible with whatever she was running on. It wasn't. Not directly. It took him 47 minutes, 3 improvised connections using components he stripped from the shuttle's secondary life support kit, and 1 very long moment where nothing seemed to be working before the seal held. He gave her 4 hours of his own air supply, which left him with about 2. "Marcus," said Dr. Vasquez quietly. "Get the shuttle prepped," he said. "We're taking her back." The medical bay aboard the UES Archimedes was designed for a crew of 42 humans. It had never been designed for this. Dr. Yumi Tanaka, ship's physician, 20 years of deep space medicine, and a woman who had seen things that had permanently rearranged her understanding of what bodies could endure, stood at the edge of the quarantine partition and watched the alien officer breathe. The breathing was the most human thing about her. Everything else was a careful, methodical exercise in difference. The Varec's respiratory cycle was longer than a human's. Deeper. Her thoracic movement was slightly wrong, not alarming, just offset like a sound playing at the wrong tempo. Her skin was a deep gray-green in normal light and shifted toward something almost amber under the medical bay's diagnostic array. Her hands had 4 fingers, though the joints were structured differently, and she held them even in unconsciousness with a precision that suggested muscular control well above baseline. The suit markings, once Dr. Vasquez had partially decoded the Varec visual language, confirmed what Marcus had intuited in the wreckage. This was not a soldier. Not in the standard sense. The best translation they had after 36 hours of intensive linguistic modeling was somewhere between Commander Sovereign and Primary Authority of a warship contingent. The word Vasquez kept coming back to, with the careful qualifier that translation was approximate, was Queen Captain. The individual who held both military command and represented the highest authority her vessel's crew would acknowledge. Which explained, in retrospect, the 11 soldiers in suits. They had died protecting her. Her name, or the closest phonetic approximation their systems could produce, was something like Sovereign. The Rin suffix, Vasquez theorized, was an honorific. Something that indicated a status above personal name. Everyone on the ship started calling her Sova. She woke on the 2nd day. Marcus was not in the medical bay when it happened. He was in debrief, his 4th, conducted by 2 officers from Earth Command's First Contact Emergency Response Team who had arrived via fast courier and were operating on approximately 4 hours of sleep and an overwhelming institutional need to understand exactly what decisions had been made and by whom. "You gave her your air supply," said Commander Reyes for the 3rd time, as though repetition might eventually produce a different answer. "Yes. Without authorization. There wasn't time for." "That is not what I asked, Sergeant." Marcus looked at him steadily. "She was dying. We had the capability to prevent it. I made a judgment call. A judgment call that exposed this crew to an unquantified biological risk, potentially violated 4 separate sections of First Contact Protocol, and committed Earth's military to an implied obligation to a species we have 0 diplomatic relationship with." "Yes," Marcus said. "All of those things." Reyes stared at him for a long moment. Then he wrote something on his tablet that Marcus couldn't see. That was when Dr. Tanaka's voice came over the communicator. "She's awake. And, you need to come to medical. All of you. She's asking for something. We don't know what yet, but she's calm and she's looking at the door." The debrief ended without ceremony. The corridor between the command section and the medical bay was 43 meters long. Marcus walked it at a normal pace because running would have communicated urgency, and he had spent 11 years learning that the first impression you made in an unknown situation was the one that lasted longest. He stepped into the medical bay. Sovereign was sitting upright on the medical platform, which had been reconfigured to accommodate her dimensions. She was still in partial suit. The quarantine team had removed the damaged sections and sealed the joints, but her chest piece and pauldrons were intact. She had clearly requested this or resisted removal, because Dr. Tanaka had flagged it in her notes as patient preference, honored for psychological stability. Her eyes, dark, with a wider iris than humans, and a subtle secondary membrane that flickered occasionally, moved across the room in a systematic sweep. Not panicked. Assessing. They stopped on Marcus. He wasn't sure how she recognized him. The suit he'd worn during the rescue had been visually similar to the others. But something, his build, his stance, some quality he couldn't name, had apparently differentiated him because Sovereign's eyes moved to him and stayed there with a quality that was unmistakably deliberate. She made a sound. It was not language exactly. Or it was language, but below the threshold of the translation systems they'd deployed, something more immediate than vocabulary. A low, resonant sound that Dr. Vasquez later described as tonal acknowledgement, the Varric equivalent of eye contact held and meaning confirmed. Marcus stood very still. Then, slowly he raised his right hand, palm outward, fingers spread. The universal human gesture of non-aggression, offered not because he expected her to understand its cultural meaning, but because it was the largest, clearest signal he could make without moving toward her. Sovereign looked at his hand. Then she raised her own, four-fingered, steady, palm outward. The room was very quiet. "She's mirroring," Dr. Vasquez said softly from the back of the room. Her voice had the particular quality of a scientist trying very hard not to cry. She's initiating a communication protocol. She's telling us she understands the gesture is communicative." Commander Reyes, who had entered behind Marcus, said nothing. Sovereign lowered her hand. Then she did something unexpected. She tilted her head very slightly toward the empty space beside her on the medical platform. An invitation, or what looked like one. Marcus glanced at Dr. Tanaka, who gave him a microscopic nod. He crossed the room and sat down. Not close. A respectful distance. Far enough that she would have room, close enough that the gesture was clearly intentional. He sat the way he always sat. Straight, hands visible, nothing performed or theatrical about it. She watched him for a moment. Then she turned her gaze to the room's far wall, and they sat in silence together, and Marcus had the distinct and unscientific impression that something had just been established between them that none of the protocols and frameworks and emergency response teams had anticipated. Not alliance. Not yet. Trust maybe. Or the first thin thread of it. Outside the Archimedes, 12 light hours away, something else was happening. The weapons scoring on Sovereign's vessel had a pattern. Dr. Vasquez's team had been analyzing it since the recovery, and the conclusion they reached, quietly without broadcasting it on open channels, was that it didn't match any known human weapons system, any asteroid impact signature, or any catalog of stellar phenomena. It matched nothing in Earth's records. Which meant something had shot her ship down. And that something might still be out there. The analysis came back at 0340 ship time, while most of the crew slept. Dr. Mirela Okonkwo, xenophysicist, weapons pattern specialist, and the person who had been awake for 31 consecutive hours staring at damage modeling data, sent her report to Captain Solberg, flagged Priority 1 with a subject line that read simply, "You need to see this." The weapons pattern on Sovereign's vessel was consistent. That was the word Okonkwo kept using in her report. Consistent. It appeared in her first paragraph, her third, her conclusion. Consistent meant deliberate. Consistent meant repeating. Consistent meant that what had torn through the port side of a Varric warship and sent it spiraling into Europa's orbital plane had not been an accident, a collision, or a system failure. It had been a volley. Multiple impacts from the same direction fired in sequence at a vessel that had been, based on the trajectory modeling, running, moving fast and in a straight line, which in space combat, Okonkwo noted, was not a survival strategy. Straight lines were what ships flew when their maneuver drives were already compromised. Sovereign's ship had been crippled before it reached the solar system. Whatever had done it, whatever had fired on a vessel that could reasonably be described as a heavy warship and reduced it to a drifting wreck, was following the same trajectory. Behind. Behind by a distance that the deepest edge of Earth's sensor network could not resolve into a specific reading. Captain Solberg read the report twice. Then she called Marcus. He arrived in her briefing room at 0402, still in off-duty fatigues, with the particular alertness of someone whose nervous system had learned to treat sleep as optional. Commander Reyes was already there, along with Dr. Vasquez and Lieutenant Commander Fidel from Fleet Tactical. Solberg put the weapons analysis on the main display without preamble. "Someone shot that ship," she said, "before it got here. And the trajectory suggests they weren't done." Fidel leaned forward. "How confident is Okonkwo in this, Red?" She's been awake for 31 hours and she still footnoted every single assumption. Make your own call. Fidel studied the display. The trajectory cone was narrow. Not a guess, a probability distribution based on multiple data points. The origin was somewhere in the outer system, past Neptune's orbital plane, in the dark where Earth's sensors were sparse and slow. What's the intercept timeline? Marcus asked. Best case based on what we know about the original weapon velocity? Between 8 and 22 days before something arrives in detectable range. That's a very wide window because we don't know if they're maintaining speed, decelerating, or have already stopped. They stopped, Marcus said. Everyone looked at him. If they were pursuing a damaged ship, they'd keep moving until they confirmed the kill. The fact that we haven't seen a follow-up strike on the wreck means either they lost her, or they stopped to assess. Either way, they know she's in this system now. They'll be cautious. Reyes frowned. You're assuming they reason the way we do. I'm assuming they reason. Species that don't reason don't build weapons that fire in consistent patterns. Marcus paused. They're thinking. They just don't know what's here. They don't know about us. The room was quiet. Vasquez said very carefully, we have to tell her. Everyone looked at the wall in the general direction of the medical bay, 43 meters and one quarantine partition away. We don't have a communication system, Reyes said. We have 40 hours of preliminary linguistic modeling and a series of gestures. Then we use what we have, Marcus said. She needs to know her enemy followed her into our system. She needs to know we know. And we need to know what we're dealing with, because right now she is the only source of intelligence we have access to. Reyes looked at Solberg. This crosses every line of First Contact Protocol. First Contact Protocol, Solberg said quietly, was written for a situation where we had time. We don't have time. She closed the display. Dane, work with Vasquez. You have 24 hours to build enough of a communication bridge to tell her what we know and ask her what she can tell us. Marcus nodded. And Dane. Solberg's voice was even measured. Don't promise her anything we can't deliver. The communication effort that followed was later studied in detail by Earth's First Contact Protocols Division, which eventually rewrote its entire framework based on what Vasquez and Dane developed in those 24 hours. It was not elegant. It used a combination of visual display screens, mathematical notation, physical models of the solar system built from components Dane stripped out of 2 different equipment lockers, and a series of carefully controlled emotional cues, tone, posture, proximity, that Vasquez theorized based on what she'd observed of Sovereign's own body language patterns. Sovereign was not passive in this process. She was, Marcus realized within the first hour, extraordinarily intelligent. Not in the abstract complementary sense that humans often applied to animals or children who exceeded expectations, but in the precise, operational sense. She identified patterns quickly. She tested hypotheses. When Marcus used the physical solar system model and pointed to Europa's orbital position, then to the wreck's estimated entry trajectory, she understood within minutes that he was describing the geometry of her arrival. She added to it. Using a stylus that Tanaka had provided, she'd indicated she wanted to write something, and they'd given her a medical notation tablet. She drew a trajectory line extending past her ship's entry point. Extending back toward the outer system. Then she drew a second shape. Behind it. The shape was not her ship. It was blockier, wider, and she drew it twice, then paused and drew it a third time and a fourth. Marcus looked at Vasquez. Vasquez looked at the display. Not one ship, she said. She's telling us there are multiple vessels. Sovereign tapped the tablet. Added something in her own script, notation they couldn't read yet. But her expression, her posture, the set of her shoulders. These things Marcus had been watching for 24 hours, and he was beginning to develop a feel for them the way you develop a feel for weather. She was not panicked. She was grave. There is a difference and it matters. Panic is the response to a threat that exceeds your framework. Gravity is the response to a threat you recognize, that you have fought before, that you know is serious, and that you are still standing to face. Whatever was following her, she'd fought them before. And she'd survived. Marcus picked up his own stylus. He drew the solar system model again. Then he drew a circle around it. He looked at her. She looked back. He added a second line. His ship, the Archimedes, positioned between Europa and the outer system boundary. He made it small because it was small. He was not going to pretend otherwise. But he held the stylus still with the ship drawn and waited. Sovereign studied the drawing for a long time. Then she reached out and drew a line connecting her ship, represented by the point where her vessel had entered the system, to his. One line. Connecting them. She tapped it once, then looked at him and held the kind of stillness that Marcus, in 11 years of service, had learned to read across species lines, across language barriers, across every variable that normally separated one person from another. She was asking if they were together in this. Marcus held her gaze. He tapped the line. Earth Command's Emergency Session 7 Alpha convened at 1100 hours on March 20, 2187, 6 days after the Archimedes first detected the Varrock distress signal, and 16 days before the outer sensor grid picked up the first confirmed reading of an unidentified fleet decelerating through the Kuiper Belt. The session lasted 14 hours. Transcript excerpts from that session were later declassified in 2201 and became part of the standard curriculum at the United Earth Defense Corps War College. Most analysts focused on the strategic decisions made, the emergency redeployment of the 3rd and 7th Fleet elements, the activation of the outer defense grid, the mobilization of reserve units stationed at Mars and the Jovian installations. What the analysts usually underemphasized, and what Marcus Dane, watching from the Archimedes via secure uplink, noticed immediately, was how much of that session was about the Archimedes itself. Specifically about him. Not by name. By decision. The session dealt extensively with the question of what his choice to extract Sovereign from the wreck, and his subsequent decision to sit beside her and tap a drawn line and imply some version of "we're in this together," had actually committed Earth to. Legally the answer was, nothing. Diplomatically the answer was, possibly everything. The distinction mattered because Earth Command, whatever its other qualities, was not naive. They understood that Sovereign was not a random survivor. She was a Queen Captain. She was the highest-ranking survivor of a vessel attack that had apparently been carried out by an adversary capable of disabling a Varrock heavy warship. She had been retrieved by humans, kept alive by human medical technology, and was now, by every reading of her behavior that Vasquez's team could provide, operating on the assumption that the humans around her were something other than bystanders. Earth Command had a word for that assumption. Obligation. The debate in Session 7 Alpha was whether to accept or disclaim it. Whether to position the Archimedes away from Europa and issue a formal non-involvement statement, or to acknowledge what Dane had started and build something around it. The decision, which took 11 hours to reach and was not unanimous, was to build. Not because of sentiment. Not because the gesture had been touching. Because Fleet Admiral Cho Sien, who had commanded 3 fleet engagements in her career and who had spent the previous 6 days reading every intelligence brief her analysts could produce about the weapons signature on Sovereign's vessel, made a point that nobody in the room was able to effectively argue against. Whatever hit that ship, she said, didn't stop at the boundary of Varrock space. It followed her here. It is now decelerating inside our system. That means one of two things. Either it doesn't know we're here, in which case we have a narrow window to establish posture before it figures out the terrain. Or it does know we're here and it doesn't care. She let that sit for a moment. I have been in this service for 34 years. I have never encountered an enemy that knew we were here and didn't care. Either we have never been relevant enough to bother with, or we have never been in the path of something that thought that way. She looked around the room. I would prefer not to learn which one this is by doing nothing. The vote was 8-3. Earth went to defense condition 2. On the Archimedes they were already adapting. The ship had not been designed as a defensive platform. It was diplomatic support, light armor, point defense only, sensors optimized for communication rather than detection. Against anything that could disable a Varrock warship, it was not a credible threat. Marcus knew this. He wasn't trying to make it a threat. What he was doing, working with Lieutenant Commander Fidel and the ship's engineering team, was making it a relay. Configuring the Archimedes sensor array to push real-time telemetry to the fleet elements that Earth Command was repositioning. Eyes further out than the standing grid, in a position that the incoming force could not easily predict, because nobody had expected a diplomatic support vessel to be sitting in Europa orbit when the situation began. It was useful without being suicidal. The distinction mattered to Marcus, who had made useful without suicidal decisions for 11 years and had a fairly refined sense of where the line was. Sovereign noticed. She had been given access to a section of the ship's secondary deck, quarantine protocol still in place, but a larger space with a viewport. She spent a significant portion of her time at that viewport, watching. And she noticed when the Archimedes began adjusting its sensor array orientation, because she watched the external emitters through the port as they repositioned, and she said something in her own language. Dr. Vasquez's translation, preparation. Then a second word or phrase more complex. Vasquez worked on it for 2 hours before she had something she was willing to call a translation. You are not running. She brought the translation to Marcus. He read it twice. What did you tell her? He asked. Nothing yet. I wasn't sure if I should. He thought about it. Tell her, we have nowhere else to be. Vasquez looked at him for a moment. Then she went to work on rendering it into the Varrock communication notation they'd built. When she delivered it, displayed on the tablet screen in their developing shared notation, Sovereign sat very still for almost 3 minutes. Then she began to draw. Not the quick sketches of their earlier communication sessions. This was careful, deliberate, detailed. She drew what Marcus eventually recognized as a schematic, a tactical representation, using the notation she'd been teaching them in fragments over the previous days. Ships, positions, movement lines. Vasquez leaned in, working through it in real time. This is a fleet formation, she said quietly. She's drawing a fleet formation. There's the ones following her. She traced the lines. 3 heavy vessels here in a forward screen. She's marking them with a symbol I think means breaching hull. Assault ships, maybe. Behind them, she paused. Behind them she's marking something larger. I don't have a translation for this marker yet. How large? Marcus asked. Vasquez measured the proportional scale Sovereign had used in her diagram. Looked up. She's using the same scale she used for her own ship in earlier drawings. Her ship was identified as approximately half a kilometer in length. She looked back down. The thing she's drawing in the rear position is about 4 times that. Nobody said anything. Sovereign tapped the large symbol and then added a word in her script beside it. Vasquez photographed it immediately and ran it through their growing lexical model. The translation that came back had multiple possible interpretations. The most consistent one was, the one that makes decisions. Marcus looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he looked at Sovereign. She met his eyes, and in them was something he recognized, not because he had any basis for reading Varrock emotional states with certainty, but because it was a state he had seen in soldiers, in commanders, in people who have spent a long time carrying difficult information and finally have someone to carry it with. Relief. And not carrying it alone anymore. The enemy fleet entered reliable sensor range on day 19. Not one fleet. 2. The second one, smaller, faster, on a different vector, was detected 6 hours after the first, and for approximately 40 minutes it appeared to be a flanking maneuver, a classic envelopment approach designed to split the defending force's attention. The tactical team on the Archimedes flagged it immediately, related to Earth Command, and watched Fleet Admiral Cho reroute 2 of the repositioned destroyer squadrons toward the secondary contact. It was the right call for a standard engagement. It was the wrong call for this one. Sovereign was watching the tactical display that Marcus had given her access to, a decision he'd made over Reyes's formal objection and Solberg's quiet approval, on the grounds that she was the only person in the solar system who had actually fought these adversaries and that keeping her in the dark served no one. When the second fleet contact appeared, she crossed the room in 4 strides and pointed at it. Then she drew a horizontal line through it. Vasquez, Marcus said. Vasquez was already beside them. She's saying, that's not the real threat. Or, she's marking it as secondary. The notation she's using is the same one she used earlier for decoys. Decoys, Marcus repeated. Their forward heavy screen might also be a decoy. She marked them as breaching ships, assault ships. But she's now adding something to that notation. Vasquez studied the addition. I think she's saying, they know the assault screen will take casualties. They're expendable. The objective isn't the assault screen. Marcus looked at the tactical display. The larger vessels, the ones in the rear, the ones bearing the symbol Vasquez had translated as the one that makes decisions, were not moving in line with the assault screen. They were holding position well back while the forward elements advanced. He pulled up the sensor resolution on the rear contacts. 2 of them. Not the 4 Sovereign's drawing had shown. Which meant either 2 had broken off, gone somewhere else, or she had been working from outdated intelligence. Can you ask her where the other 2 are? He said. Vasquez worked quickly. Sovereign read the notation and her response was immediate. She doesn't know, Vasquez said. She lost sensor contact with them 3 weeks before she reached us. 3 weeks. Marcus did the math. 3 weeks, traveling at whatever speed Sovereign's vessel had been moving before it was damaged, at whatever heading those 2 vessels might have taken. He didn't like the math. I need to talk to Fidel, he said and moved toward the tactical station. What he told Fidel and what Fidel relayed to Earth Command was a hypothesis rather than a certainty. But it was a hypothesis built on pattern recognition and the cold logic of how a competent military force divided its objectives. The assault screen was real but expendable. The 2 visible capital ships were command and control. The two missing vessels were doing something else, and the something else, given the geometry of the solar system and the positions of Earth's defensive assets, was most likely an approach vector that avoided the main sensor grid. Mars. Or the Lagrange platforms at L4 and L5. Or, worst case, the relay stations at the inner boundary, which were not heavily defended because they had never needed to be, because no one had ever approached Earth's inner system with hostile intent. The warning went out at 1,643 hours. 18 minutes later, the inner boundary relay station at L4 picked up a contact, not on the main sensor array, but on the backup collision avoidance radar that nobody had thought to include in the threat monitoring network because it was designed to detect rocks, not ships. The two missing capital vessels were already inside the main defensive perimeter. They had used the outer assault to pull attention outward. It was not a new tactic. It was, in fact, a tactic with a long history in human military doctrine. It had been documented in Earth's war colleges for centuries, which told Marcus something important about the species that had followed Sovereign into his solar system. They were very, very good at this. Earth Command's response was not elegant, but it was fast, faster than the enemy appeared to have expected. The reserve destroyer squadrons at Mars reached the L4 approach vector in 40 minutes and established a blocking position that, while it would not stop the capital ships outright, would slow them and cost them significantly to push through. Marcus was watching the tactical display when Sovereign appeared at his shoulder. She studied the Mars defender positions. She pointed to the blocking force. Then she looked at Marcus and said something in her own language, not through the notation system, not through Vasquez, but directly looking at him, with a tone that his 11 years of reading human faces and voices made him certain was not a question. Vasquez, who had been listening, said quietly, "I think she's naming them." "Naming who?" "Your people. Your ships." She paused. "The word she's using, I've only seen it in one other context in her language samples. She used it in her schematic when she was drawing her own forces. Her own protective screen." Marcus waited. "The closest translation I have is, those who hold the line." He looked at the tactical display. The small cluster of Earth destroyer icons, holding position between the two missing capital ships and the inner system. Then he looked at Sovereign. She met his eyes. Then, without ceremony, she turned back to the display and began pointing. Not randomly, but with the focused precision she always used when she was providing information rather than reacting to it. Pointing at the capital ship positions, tracing movement vectors, indicating with her stylus what she expected them to do next. She was advising. She had been watching and assessing, and now she was sharing what she knew. Marcus pulled up a recording channel. "Vasquez," he said, "everything she says from this point forward, I want translated in real time as closely as you can manage and relayed directly to Fleet Command. Every word." "Marcus, my translation accuracy is still. Best effort real time. Go." And Vasquez went. For the next 6 hours, Sovereign advised the defense of a solar system she had arrived in 19 days earlier, wounded and alone, and the humans who had chosen not to leave her in the wreck of her ship translated her knowledge into tactical decisions that Earth's fleet commanders implemented with the particular combination of skepticism and pragmatism that is the defining quality of military professionals who are out of better options. None of it was perfect. 3 Earth vessels were lost in the engagements that followed. One of the relay stations was damaged beyond repair. The L4 blocking force took casualties that Marcus would not let himself think about in detail until much later, when the numbers had names attached to them. But the inner system held. The battle for the inner system lasted 11 days. Not continuously, wars rarely work that way, whatever the dramatic reconstructions suggest. It was 11 days of intervals, pressure and response, contact and withdrawal, probe and counter. The enemy fleet, which Earth's tactical teams had begun calling the Keth, a name derived from what Vasquez had identified as Sovereign's term for them, though the precise meaning was still debated, operated with a consistency that was both impressive and clarifying. They were not trying to destroy Earth. This took some time to accept at the strategic level, because the intuitive assumption when an unknown fleet enters your system and attacks your installations is that annihilation is the objective. But Fleet Admiral Cho, working with Vasquez's translations of Sovereign's tactical analysis, reached a different conclusion on day 4. They were trying to recover Sovereign, or prevent her from providing intelligence. The distinction was operationally significant, because a force trying to recover or silence a specific individual behaves differently than a force trying to destroy. It maintains certain axes of advance. It accepts certain risks on certain vectors while being unexpectedly cautious on others. It does not, notably, use its full destructive capability against installations that it could easily reduce to debris, because obliterating everything indiscriminately makes recovery or confirmation impossible. The Keth, Sovereign had told them, through the increasingly functional notation system and Vasquez's increasingly rapid translations, were not conquerors. Not primarily. They were, as best as she could explain within the limits of their shared vocabulary, something closer to pursuers. They had been pursuing her for a long time. The question of why, what she knew or what she represented, or what had happened before her ship limped into Earth's solar system, was a question Marcus had been working on carefully for 19 days. Not because it wasn't important. Because he was certain it was important enough that pushing too hard before Sovereign was ready to tell them would close that door permanently. On day 6 she told him. Not in the notation system. Not in translated words. She told him the way you tell someone something when language is insufficient. She showed him. She had a data storage device in a sealed compartment in her chest armor. The chest armor she had not allowed Tanaka to remove, which now made sense. She produced it with the deliberateness of someone making a decision they have been weighing for some time. The device, when interfaced with the Archimedes computer systems by a very careful and very excited engineering team over the following 8 hours, contained something that Vasquez described in her report as a map, or something that functions as a map, a spatial representation of a region of space that, once Earth's navigation team oriented it relative to known stellar cartography, was identified as a section of the outer arm roughly 200 light-years from Earth's position. And within that map, marked with designations that Vasquez was still decoding, were positions. Fleet positions. Resource positions. What appeared to be installation locations. Keth territory. Sovereign had been carrying Keth strategic intelligence when her ship was attacked. And she had chosen, on day 6 of her stay aboard the Archimedes, to give it to the species that had pulled her out of a wreck and sat beside her in the quiet and tapped a drawn line. Marcus understood the weight of that. He also understood that it made her a target of a very specific kind, and that the Keth's operational behavior in the days since was suddenly much more explicable. He went to Captain Solberg immediately. "They know she gave us something," he said. "Or they're assuming she will. Either way, the tactical posture shifts now. They'll accept higher losses to reach this ship." Solberg looked at the map data on her screen. "What do you recommend?" "Move us," Marcus said. "Away from the established defensive positions. If they're orienting on us specifically, being near the fleet elements puts the fleet elements at additional risk. Separate and mobile is harder to target than stationary and protected. If we separate, we lose the fleet's defensive coverage." "Yes. But we're already what they're shooting at. Might as well make it harder to hit." Solberg approved the repositioning. The Archimedes moved. On day 8, a Keth fast intercept vessel, smaller than the capital ships, faster, with a profile that Sovereign identified immediately as a dedicated pursuit craft, broke through the outer defensive screen on a direct vector for their new position. It had, Marcus estimated, known exactly where they were. The Archimedes had no weapons capable of stopping it. What it had was a 14-second warning from the sensor net, Marcus Dane's judgment about which angle of approach the intercept vessel would prioritize, and a decision. The decision was, the medical bay was on the port side. The intercept vessel was approaching from port. Moving Sovereign to the starboard sections would take 40 seconds they didn't have. But the portside cargo module, pressurized, structurally reinforced, part of the original diplomatic mission's secure document storage, was between the medical bay and the hull. He moved her there. He and Dr. Tanaka and a crew member named Petty Officer Rashid, who moved fast and didn't ask questions. Then he stayed in the corridor outside the cargo module door because the corridor was the next structural layer between the cargo module and the hull, and because the hit, when it came, was going to come from the direction he was standing in. The intercept vessel did not fire on them directly. What it did was detonate at close range. A proximity strike, not a precision weapon, the kind of tactical choice that suggested it was not trying to recover Sovereign and had moved to denial. The detonation shredded the portside exterior plating across a 40-meter section. The blast wave propagated through the corridor where Marcus was standing with the physics of violence. Not a movie explosion, not theatrical, but a concussive pressure wave and fragmentation pattern that arrived before human reaction time could process that it had started. He was found by the damage control team 11 minutes later. Alive. The corridor had partially shielded him. The cargo module behind him had fully shielded Sovereign. The injuries were significant. 3 cracked ribs, a right arm fracture at the radius, laceration to the scalp, moderate concussion, and a piece of the corridor's internal conduit casing embedded in his left shoulder that Tanaka later said had missed the subclavian artery by a margin she would not specify because the number made her uncomfortable. He was conscious when they found him. Barely. He asked about Sovereign before he asked about anything else. They told him she was unharmed. He closed his eyes. When Sovereign was brought out of the cargo module, she saw the corridor. Vasquez, who was present, later wrote in her notes, "I do not have the vocabulary to translate what she said. I don't think our notation system has the depth for it yet. But I know what I saw. I know what that looks like on a human face." She understood. Sovereign walked through the damaged corridor to where they were stabilizing Marcus on a transport litter. She crouched beside him. She placed one four-fingered hand, carefully, deliberately, on the undamaged section of his left arm. She did not move for a long time. The Keth withdrew on day 11. Not destroyed. Not defeated in any total sense. Withdrawn. A distinction that Earth's strategic analysts spent the following months arguing over with the fervor of people who understood that the difference between defeated and withdrawn would determine every foreign policy decision of the next decade. The proximate cause was the loss of their two capital ships, which occurred on day 10 when the refitted mining platforms at the Jovian L4 and L5 points, equipped under emergency authorization with the mass driver systems that had been in development for asteroid deflection since 2178, fired coordinated strikes on a targeting solution provided by Sovereign's intelligence map. It was not a surgical strike. Mass drivers at that range were not precise instruments. What they were was energetic, and the two Keth capital vessels, which had been holding position at the edge of the inner system in a posture Sovereign had identified as command observation, were not positioned to avoid kinetic impactors traveling at a significant fraction of their theoretical terminal velocity. The loss of both command ships, and presumably the command authority aboard them, produced the withdrawal. The pursuit craft, the assault screen, the secondary elements, all of them reversed course over the following 18 hours and began moving back toward the outer system on a heading that Earth's tracking systems maintained for 47 days before the contacts fell below reliable detection threshold. Fleet Admiral Cho did not celebrate. In the recording of her command center during the withdrawal, declassified later, widely watched, she can be seen standing at the main display, watching the Keth contacts fade, with an expression that her staff members consistently described in interviews as not relief. The closest word most of them used was calculation. She was already thinking about what came next. Marcus Dane spent 9 days in the medical bay. The shoulder wound required 2 surgeries and would leave a mobility limitation in his left arm that the rehabilitation specialists assessed as permanent at 30% and ultimately resolved to something closer to 10%, which Marcus consistently described as acceptable and his physical therapist consistently described as the result of being exceptionally stubborn. He was not alone in the medical bay. Sovereign had been given a space adjacent to his section. Not quarantine, not isolation, but a respectable separation that served the mutual and unspoken agreement that the medical bay was large enough for both of them to occupy without protocol requiring they be in the same room, while also being small enough that the partition between them was a formality rather than a reality. She was there when he was moved in. She was there when he woke from the second surgery. She was there during the long recovery hours when he was functional enough to be conscious but not functional enough to be useful, which was the state he found most difficult to inhabit. They talked. Not in English. Not in Varrock. In the notation system that Vasquez had built and Sovereign had expanded and Marcus had contributed to in ways that were less linguistically formal and more practically functional, the language of two people who need to communicate and have found the tools that work. He asked her, on day 4 of his recovery, why she had been carrying the intelligence map. Whether it had been her mission to deliver it somewhere, or whether she had been carrying it for other reasons. Her answer took Vasquez an hour to fully decode. The summary as Vasquez rendered it was this. Sovereign had been at war with the Keth for what she estimated as the equivalent of 30 human years. The map, the intelligence data, had been assembled over that period by a coalition of Varrock commanders who understood that the war was not winnable by attrition. The Keth had more ships, more resources, and a patience that was less a psychological quality and more a strategic doctrine. They could maintain pressure longer than the Varrock could sustain defense. The intelligence map was not a weapon. It was an offering. She had been traveling toward a destination, which she indicated was in a direction that Earth's navigation team identified as broadly toward the galactic core, to find a species they had intelligence on but had never contacted. A species that the Varrock's own scouts had identified as industrially significant and militarily untested. A species that had not yet been involved in the Keth's expansion. She had not made it. The Keth had intercepted her before she reached the contact window. And the ship they'd crippled had limped into a solar system that was not, by any plan or design, her destination. Marcus read Vasquez's decoded summary 3 times. Then he looked at the partition between his section and Sovereign's. She was there. He could see her silhouette through the translucent material. He wrote in the notation system, "You were looking for us." Not a question. The reply came back in under a minute. "Not you specifically. I was looking for someone not yet chosen." Then, after a pause that felt deliberate, "That is, perhaps, the same thing." The diplomatic proceedings that followed the Keth withdrawal were long, complicated, and outside the scope of what Marcus Dane had any authority over. What he had authority over was his recovery, his return to duty, and the question of what came next for the individual who was, by any reasonable diplomatic assessment, the most important person aboard the Archimedes and one of the most important individuals in the solar system. Sovereign remained. Not because she was required to. Not because Earth Command had formally detained her. They had not, and the legal frameworks around her status were a separate and ongoing argument. She remained because she chose to, and when the question was raised formally through Vasquez's translation, her response was characteristically direct. Her vessel was destroyed. Her crew was dead. She had delivered her intelligence to the humans who had pulled her from the wreck and, in the absence of the destination she'd been traveling toward, they were now the destination. This was not sentiment. It was operational logic. The Varric Queen captain was not going to remain aboard the Archimedes because she had developed a personal attachment to the place. She remained because the work was not finished. The Keth had withdrawn, not retreated. They would assess. They would recalibrate. They would return, and the next approach would account for what they had learned about human capabilities, human response times, human defensive positions. The only advantage Earth had, the only real, durable advantage, was the intelligence map, Sovereign's 30 years of operational knowledge, and whatever diplomatic and strategic relationship could be built between two species that had been in the same solar system for less than a month. She understood this. Earth Command was beginning to understand it. Marcus understood it immediately, because he had spent 11 years watching what happened when organizations failed to appreciate the strategic value of assets that presented in inconvenient or unexpected forms. He made a formal recommendation to Captain Solberg on day 7 of his recovery, written because he was still managing concussion headaches and preferred to be precise when precision mattered. The recommendation was simple: establish a permanent joint working group, human and Varric, military and diplomatic, focused on the Keth, on the strategic situation, on building the framework for something that Earth had never had to build before. Not an alliance exactly. Not yet. Alliances required negotiation and ratification and legal frameworks and all the institutional machinery that would take years. A partnership. In the immediate, operational sense. Between people who had chosen to be in this together, even when the choice was not required. Solberg forwarded the recommendation to Earth Command. Earth Command's formal response took 6 days. Informal approval came through in 6 hours. On the morning that Marcus was cleared for light duty, he found Sovereign standing at the viewport in the medical bay, the same viewport she'd been given access to on her second day aboard, the one that looked out at the long dark of the solar system. He stood beside her. Outside, very far away, 2 Earth destroyer squadrons were running patrol patterns on the outer sensor boundary. They were smaller than anything in Sovereign's tactical drawings, smaller than anything in her experience of war. But they were there, and they were moving, and they were doing the thing that Marcus had spent his career doing in various forms. Holding the line. He didn't say anything. After a while, Sovereign made a sound, the low tonal acknowledgement that he'd come to understand as her version of noted, or I see, or the particular form of recognition that doesn't need words because the moment is already doing the work. Then she turned from the viewport and looked at him. And Marcus Dane, who was not the most decorated soldier in the Corps, who was methodical rather than inspired, who had made a series of judgment calls that nobody had authorized and that had turned out to matter more than anyone planned, Marcus looked back. The work was not finished. But this, he thought, was how it started. Not with declarations or ceremonies or the formal machinery of first contact. With a damaged ship in Europa orbit. With a corridor he'd chosen to stand in. With a hand placed carefully on an undamaged arm. With 2 people looking out at the same dark and deciding, separately and together, that it was worth facing.